Hi, everybody. We are live. I'm Debbie Schwartz, founder of Road to College and the Paying for College 101 group. And I'm here tonight with Jeff Selingo. And we've got a great topic that we're going to talk about. But before we actually get into things, and I see people jumping on, I like to kind of give people the chance. You probably just got notified, get comfortable, get your glass of wine, get your cup of tea for the evening, because there's going to be a lot of good stuff to hear tonight. And say hello, put a comment, say something in the comments, just, say where you're from. If you've got, if you're a parent of a senior, high school senior, college student, we always just like to know. It's nice to know who's out there watching. And we will get started in a minute. But it's great to have Jeff tonight. And I'm going to give a little background about you, Jeff, and then if you want to add to it, and then, we'll get in. We've got a lot of topics to cover, but as always, if anybody has questions, put them in the comments. We will try to get to the questions. We may not answer them immediately, but, we'll try and scroll back if there's something good. But we want to hear what your questions are. They're really important, and they will help drive also what we're going to talk about tonight. So welcome, Jeff. Thanks for being here tonight.
It's great to be here, Debbie. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Do I get a glass of wine too? Or
I know, right? That would be nice. Then we might not get through tonight's session.
Wine and wisdom. Can't get better than that. So
it's great to have Jeff here. And for anybody who doesn't, recognize Jeff, but you probably, will by now. Let me just give you a little background on what Jeff has been doing for many years, and then he can fill us in. But Jeff has been a writer for higher ed for over 20 years. He's published a variety of media, including in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, New York Times, Chronicle of Higher Education. You're also a co-host of the podcast Future You, so maybe we'll put that out in the comments too. Yep. And you're the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers already, and you have your new book coming out next week, yep, which is Who Gets In and Why, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, A Year Inside College Admissions. So it's being published September 15th, but you guys can pre-order it, and we'll talk about that tonight as well. And this is a very interesting book, and it gives readers an inside look into the selection process at 3 different schools, and it reveals not only what the gatekeepers are looking for, but ultimately how the final admissions decisions are really made. So lots to talk about tonight. Did I miss anything, Jeff? I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, I mean, it's first of all, it's great to be here. I love doing these because I think this is an interesting time for college admissions and paying for college. Obviously, this has always been something that has made parents and students a little bit anxious. And I think this year, that anxiety level, given everything else happening in the world, and throw a pandemic on top of it, has really just been increased, right? Last weekend, 200,000 students had their SAT test canceled. That's about 50% of the students who were supposed to take it. This weekend, the ACT is also canceling tests. So there's a lot of concern about what's happening right now in college admissions and paying for college. So really excited to be here tonight. And Debbie, just one quick, as you said, the book is a pre-order right now for many of your favorite local booksellers or online at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop. And Debbie will place in the comments, as will I, if you order it and forward it to Jeff Selingo preorder at gmail.com. You'll get access to a bunch of goodies that I'm giving out, including, I was showing Debbie earlier, this cool, nifty book plate, they call them. And basically you stick it in front of your book. It will be signed because I can't actually physically see people right now.
Right.
It's a great way to get your book signed, and it's numbered. So we only have so many of these. If you pre-order the book, very special.
So, I don't really, I mentioned it I mentioned this when I do Facebook Lives, but I don't even know if I've told you, Jeff, but I have a high school senior.
Oh, so, I didn't know that. No.
Yeah, I know. I don't think you knew that. So I am going through the agony of everything you talked about and everything else that people are facing here. So besides just kind of being in this space, this is now very personal. And so I'm living and breathing, everything that we're going to talk about tonight.
Yeah.
So, okay. So why don't we set the scene for people, who don't know, really what the book's about. And you spent part of 2018 and 2019 in admissions offices at different colleges. Just tell us like what which schools they were, was there a reason why you picked those schools, and kind of really, I'm all kind of curious how much access they really gave you.
So I picked 3 schools, and in many ways, the process of choosing those 3 schools was as random and as ambiguous as the college admissions process itself. I originally went out to 24 schools, 24, and I only looked at selective institutions. Believe it or not, the average acceptance rate in American higher education is 65%. So we keep talking about how difficult it is to get into college. In reality, it really isn't. But a lot of people are trying to go to those essentially top 200 schools that are called selective because they accept fewer than half of the students who apply. So I was looking mostly at those schools. I didn't want to go to the ultra selectives. So I wasn't really looking at like the Stanfords and the Harvards where maybe only 5 or 6% of students get in. I wanted to go to places where you can actually get in, but where decisions are being made every day about who gets in and why. So I went out to 24 schools. Only 3 said yes. The 3 I eventually chose.
Interesting.
We could get into later why I think some of those others said no. But it ended up being a great group of institutions because it was a small liberal arts college, a big private urban institution, and then a big public. And 80% of American students go to public. So it was really important for me to have a selective public.
Well, it's kind of funny. I thought maybe you had purposely, put that mix together because it did kind of hit.
And I kind of wanted it, right? So once I felt like I was going to do more than one school, because again, I wanted to give people a flavor for how a small liberal arts college, Davidson College, just outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, a big urban private university, which was Emory University in Atlanta, and then finally the University of Washington in Seattle. So I wanted to give people a flavor of how these different types of institutions choose their classes. I had complete access. There was a couple of limitations. One is, 3 institutions. I obviously couldn't be there all at the same time. And I live in Washington, D.C., and those are obviously out of town. So it was the days I could get there. Some people say, well, how do you know they just didn't hide all the things they didn't want you to see on the day you were there? The year I was there, Emory received over 30,000 applications for regular decision in a very short, they have to review those applications in January and February, essentially. They have 2 months. They don't have time to kind of worry about when I'm going to be there and not be there. And so that was one limitation of when I could be there. And the second limitation is I couldn't identify any of the students, obviously. So I read the applications, I sat with them. I couldn't identify anybody by name. And sometimes I was a little vague in where the person was from because I wanted to include as many details from their applications as possible. Quoting from the essays, grades, and things like that. And I was afraid that if I mentioned somebody's hometown or high school, that somebody reading the book could kind of figure out who it was. So I was a little vague sometimes on the student, but otherwise I had open access. I could be there when I wanted to be, see what I wanted to see, quote what I wanted to quote. There was no other limitations on my reporting.
And had you ever been inside an admissions office before?
No, I covered higher education for more than 20 years, but most of my time was covering other things, other student issues, leadership, college presidents, finances. There were all these other things that I had covered especially at my time at the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I was editor for 4 years and worked for 16 years in a variety of other roles. I actually really never covered admissions. So it was kind of a new world for me in doing this book. And it opened up my eyes to what is really going on. And I hope through the book in explaining what's going on is that we kind of reduce the temperature and the anxiety a little bit because so much is out of your control, meaning you, the parent, or your son or daughter.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know if that actually reduces anxiety or not, but it is nice to kind of know, there's only so much you can control. And maybe after that, you have to just let go.
Yeah. And that to me is really not only the thesis of the book, but even more important now during coronavirus. Now, obviously I reported this book before coronavirus, but I think this book in many ways is more relevant than ever before. And I'm not just saying that because I'm trying to sell a book that comes out on Tuesday, but it really explains the playing field that you as a student or you as a parent or you as a family is going to be, you're going to be navigating over the next year. Now, obviously some of the rules have changed. A bunch of colleges, for example, have gone test optional. So some of the rules have changed, but the basic playing field that you're going to be on hasn't changed. And mostly how they're going to review applicants hasn't changed that much. So I think if you understand that ecosystem that I describe in the book, I think you're going to be much better prepared for the year ahead.
And you know what? I actually completely agree. You know, I read the book and I knew that, you know, you had put it together. You had, you know, gone to admissions offices way before, you know, and who knew that coronavirus was going to come and upend everything in admissions. But a lot of what you talk about is still valid, you know, even if schools have gone test optional, you know, like how admissions officers are going through the process isn't going to change that dramatically. So I completely agree that everything that's in there is still valid this year and probably for a long time, you know, regardless of, you know, what has happened because of the pandemic and admissions. But so let's get into it a little bit. I mean, I'm just going to read a quote from your book, and then, you know, we can, and it leads into kind of how you've categorized different schools.
Yep.
So you say colleges operate their admission cycles in two different worlds, depending mostly on where they stand in the academic pecking order. Knowing how to navigate these distinct worlds makes you like an early explorer possessing a map of distant, unknown lands. The first thing to recognize is that colleges are either buyers or sellers. So, I mean, I do think that this idea of navigating and people kind of having to know the rules of the game or rules of the road are important. And, you know, I'd love for you to kind of elaborate on this concept of buyers and sellers and why it's important for kind of families to understand this.
And Debbie, this was probably one of the most critical, and I dedicate a whole chapter of the book to this idea of buyers and sellers, because one of the things I realized during the process is that we often talk about fit in a college. And you know this from your community here, the financial fit and how critical that is. But for many families who are embarking on the college search, we tend to talk about the other two pieces of fit first. The academic fit, you know, is the college the right academic fit? Can I succeed there? And does it have the major I want to major in? And then the social fit. And that could include, you know, is the campus where I want it to be located? Is it big, small? Does it have sports? All that other stuff. We tend not to think about the financial fit. And I think there's many reasons for that. And it really doesn't matter what your family income is, because I think a lot of people think, well, we'll worry about paying for it later, or we don't want to deny our child this chance at going to the college that they really dream of. We think that everyone's going to get a scholarship because that's what we keep hearing about. We keep hearing about all these colleges discounting their tuition. And what ends up happening is that students then apply to a variety of colleges. They come up with their college list based on those first two factors, academic fit and social fit. And then the acceptances roll in. And then after that, as you know, the financial aid offers roll in. And I saw this over and over again in reporting the book. So in April now, you're talking in April of your senior year, you're getting those financial aid offers, and you have a couple of weeks to make a decision by May 1. And all these students would come in to their counselor when I was sitting with counselors, and I described this in the book, and they said, hey, I got into fill in the blank school. And the counselor's like, that's great. That's your dream school. My parents don't know how they're going to pay for it, or they can't afford it, or whatever, fill in the blank. And as I talked to these students, I realized, well, why did you think you were going to get aid from that school? Because that's a really high ranked school, and they don't give out aid to get you in the door, right? And that's really the distinction between these buyers and sellers. So quite simply, the sellers are the haves of admissions. There are about 10% of schools, so there's only about 50 or 60 schools that are the sellers. Think of them as the very top ranked schools in the U.S. News and World Report rankings. And they have something to sell to students, usually a brand name. They get way many more applicants than they have spots. And so what they do is they give out a lot of financial aid, but they give almost all of that financial aid exclusively to students who really need it. So it's really based on need. They don't give out much merit aid, if any at all. And they don't do those big discounts that you hear everybody giving out, because people who can afford to go there are willing to write that whole check. So they don't have to do that. They don't have to discount tuition. The vast majority of colleges are what I call buyers. And this is not just kind of a bifurcated list. There's a range of buyers. Some are really extreme buyers, meaning they give out huge discounts to attract students. Some are less so on that scale. And they have to buy students because they have to lure them in with something, right? Their brand names are pretty good in some cases, but they're not like the sellers where everybody's kind of lining up at their door to get in. And so why is this important? Because when you're crafting that list in the beginning, you not only have to look at that academic and social fit and is this a stretch school academically for me, or a foundational or a safety school for me? But do I have enough buyers and sellers on this list so that when I get to the other end of this in April, we're able to have some buyers on that list who are willing to give me some financial aid. And especially this is very true for middle income and upper middle income and wealthier families who may not qualify for need-based aid at some schools. And I had so many families tell me this, right? I'm above the cutoff for need-based aid, but I can't afford to write a full check. They are the perfect example for buyers. And one last thing, Debbie, on the buyers, people think, well, the sellers their education's great and the buyers are not so good. This has nothing to do with educational quality. In fact, there are many great buyers out there from an education standpoint. And I think really from a financial standpoint, you just need to have a mix of these schools on your list.
I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we've seen it now for years in the Paying for College 101 group, and it's exactly the time that you say, kind of the end of March, April time period, where we hear all these stories of, my daughter or son got into XYZ school, great school, we're really happy. Oh my God, how am I going to pay for this? And you're kind of like, your heart sinks, because the big thing which you're also pointing at is that you have to have options at that point, and so if you haven't kind of applied to a multiple range of schools, you may not have that option to fall back on to the school that you can afford.
Well, and I think that's the key thing, because in April, you can't suddenly start applying for more schools, especially if you are applying to a range of, very highly selective schools. They're not going to take an application from you in April. It's too late at that point. And there were so many students and families I talked with that said, I just wish I knew this 10 months ago or 11 months ago. And I think it goes back to this whole conversation, and this from your groups. Parents and students are just unwilling to have this financial conversation early on. And again, many students, my parents never told me they wouldn't pay for this, right? Because you don't really have these conversations until you see where you get in. And again, when you're crafting this list, if you have 8 schools on there, 10 schools on there, how many you have on there, make sure you have this mix of buyers and sellers, and make sure every school on that list is a school you actually want to go to.
Right.
That's another important thing, right? Because you may, for financial reasons, have to go to number 10 on your list, and make sure you're as excited about number 10 as you are about number 1.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Again, I have a senior, and I've already said this to him. All these schools that you put on the list, if you have to go to them, I don't mean have to in a bad way, but if you end up, and you're accepted and this is the only one, you need to feel comfortable that you're going to go there. So you can't just put kind of willy-nilly, schools on the list. You have to feel good about it academically, socially, and financially. And if you know this system ahead of time, you really shouldn't have so many surprises come April and March and April of next year. And, somebody mentioned in the comments, and I'm just going to highlight this because this is a little bit of a pet peeve to me. Stop using dream schools.
Yes, because I agree with that. I don't like this word safety schools either. So I wouldn't want to use that either. Those are more foundational schools, because you may end up, that may be all you get into. And that's another thing about the sellers. The sellers are inundated with applications. They're highly selective. And so the more sellers you have on your list, you also risk not getting into any of them, or only one of them if you're lucky. And then again, you're going to be stuck with this decision. Well, I got into this one school and now they won't give me the financial aid I need. So now what do I do? Right. You do not want to be put in that position. Trust me, because there's nothing you can do at that point. You're really stuck.
Okay, I'm just going to show this. This is just a fun comment. So somebody saying, I'm a parent of a 21 grad from Pittsburgh, and you're watching this instead of the Steelers. That's good.
I appreciate that.
Okay, so this is and we also put in the comments. There's a link to more of this discussion on your buyers and sellers. So if people kind of want to hear more about that, plus obviously it's in the book, and you go into much more detail about buyers and sellers and kind of how you might be able to identify them. So, this is September. for all you parents out there with, high school seniors, this is the perfect time to be doing this type of researching, understanding the landscape, understanding buyers and sellers and kind of the range of colleges you need to have on there. And I'll tell you, if you are a parent of a high school junior, this is a great time to be kind of, getting your feet wet about what this process is all about, so that you're not surprised, next year, and you can kind of start planting those seeds of the conversations with your kids.
Critically important. I for some reason, we avoid these conversations, and I get it. There's a great book that was written by an NYU researcher last year, Caitlin Zaloom, Indebted, which talked about this idea of potential, right? We all want to cultivate the potential of our kids, and many families, as a result, stretch too far in order to cultivate the potential. And to be honest with you, you can cultivate that potential at a range of schools. And I think that's the key here. Range academically, socially, and financially.
So I'm just going to share this one comment from Michelle, because this is kind of interesting. She's saying, I'm finding high schools do not educate families very well. They should be talking about this to parents in first grade with 529 plans, sixth grade with discussions about merit aid, ninth grade with how much it really costs. I mean, you are so right, Michelle. It's unfortunately, that's what happened. But hope, thank goodness we've got books like Jeff's coming out and Facebook Lives that we can have. But you're right. In the perfect world, more of this information might be coming through.
Well, Debbie, and I don't know how many fall into this category who are on tonight, but the other thing is around sports, right? We tend to think that I'm going to invest, and I talk about this. There's a whole chapter in the book dedicated to athletics. We tend to invest a lot in our kids athletically because we think, they're going to get that scholarship. And it's amazing to me, not only the small percentage of students who actually end up with college scholarships, but the number of college scholarships that are essentially broken apart into smaller parts, right? And some people might essentially get enough money for books. That will be their athletic scholarship, right? So really, we really need to be much more educated about what is merit aid, what is need-based aid. Maybe we'll get into this later. Need blind schools, need aware schools, meets full need, gapping. There are so many confusing terms in higher ed on the financial aid side and also on the admissions side that it almost means you probably can also put a whole class together on this for high school sophomores and
absolutely. Even the word, and somebody actually mentioned it a little earlier, even the word need, is kind of like confusing, and the word scholarship is confusing, because when you say that, are you talking about private scholarship, and what does a college scholarship mean versus a private scholarship? So there's a lot of, unfortunately, confusion, but I also don't want to scare people, because if you dig in just a little bit, you can get clarity. But you just need to know that you're going to have to dig in and kind of find this information a little bit on your own. But there's definitely a lot of good resources out there to help. So because I think our audience is very conscious about costs, and I wanted to actually comment, I think that the majority of families have an issue with paying for college, and you can be, upper middle class to lower middle class. Your issues might be different, but most families, are facing this as a major hurdle. So
most families cannot. If you're going to a private college, you're talking $60,000, $70,000, $80,000 a year, full price, all in. There's not many families out there that can not only write that check once,
exactly.
but 4 times.
That's the thing, right? Once, and then if you got multiple kids, forget it.
And by the way, in multiple years, right? So that's the other thing I think about paying for college, is that we tend to think about it for that first year, and it's a 4-year path, and 1 year doesn't do you any good because you don't get any credential after 1 year to actually use in the job market. So think about this as a 4-year investment.
Yep. So I actually had my own notes. I was going to go on to something, but I'm seeing some of the questions. So maybe you could, and we don't, have to go into a lot of detail, but like somebody's asking, what is 100% need met? Maybe you could just go through a little bit of those terminologies about, what is need, what's 100% need, to kind of just lay the foundation for people.
So I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible, but there's a lot going on here. So first is this idea of need blind admissions. And a lot of schools claim to practice need blind admissions, but it's very critical to understand what that means. Need blind admissions basically means that when you're applying for college in the admissions process, they are not taking your financial need into consideration. Now, do they know how much money you have? Of course they do in many ways. They know your zip code.
Right.
On the Common App, you have to put your job titles
Right.
and stuff
They know
like that, right?
high school you're coming
They know what
from.
high school you're going from, right? So it's not truly blind because there's all these other things that they know, but they're not taking that into consideration during the admissions process. Now, just because they're need blind doesn't mean that if you get accepted, you're going to be able to afford it, because most need blind schools do not meet full need. What does meet full need mean? At some point in the process, you're going to complete the FAFSA, and at a couple hundred schools, you're also going to complete something called the CSS profile. Both of these are financial consideration forms. The free application for student aid is the FAFSA form. That's a government formula for how much your expected family contribution is. The CSS profile is slightly different. It treats some assets differently. Most schools use that. Most selective schools use that, who give out a lot of money, because they don't want to give out money to students they don't think deserve it. Because there's a lot of assets that you're able to kind of keep off the table in the FAFSA that you're not able to keep off in the CSS profile. Either way, it's going to spit out this formula that basically says, here's what you as a family could contribute. Now, this is an important point, because just because the formula says that, you might look at that and you're like, I can't afford $20,000 a year or whatever, but that's the formula. And
Right.
if a school is going to meet the difference, that means they have met 100% of demonstrated financial needs. So if the school is $70,000 and your expected contribution is $20,000, that $50,000 difference, and if they meet all that, that means they have met 100% need. Now,
so I just want to emphasize, because some people think 100% need, they're going to walk away and not have to pay anything.
That's not true. Now, for some people it is, because their EFC is zero. Right. They don't have to contribute anything. They're not expected to contribute everything. And those schools that do meet full need will give you all that money. But that is not the case for most people.
So whatever you end up as a family, your EFC is, you've got to you may not be able to, but that is the number that the schools are kind of likely hold you to, that you're going to have to afford.
Exactly. And now the difference is, again, that meet full need. Now, some schools don't. So they'll accept you. They'll say, okay, your expected contribution is $20,000, but there's a $50,000 difference here, and we're only going to give you enough money. We're going to give you $40,000 or $30,000. And then there's what's called a gap in between those two things. And a lot of schools gap students because they just can't afford to put in more money to those students. And so students end up going to those schools, and that's how students get or families take out a lot of loans, because that's how they usually make up that gap. They usually take out a private loan or a Parent Plus loan to make up that gap. So a school could be need blind, meaning they don't take financial aid into consideration in your admissions decision, but then they gap you. And so it's almost like they denied you because really, can you afford to go there? And if you can't afford to go there, you're going to tell them no. Need aware. So let's just go through this quickly. Need aware admissions. And we have a great piece on your website, Debbie, that's from Lafayette College, which is a need aware college in Pennsylvania, which is an excerpt from the book that talks about how they use need during the admissions process. So Lafayette and a bunch of other colleges are what they call need aware. They don't think it's actually fair to do what I just talked about, to accept somebody and then not give them enough aid and to gap them. They think that puts families into a tough situation. They would rather tell somebody, we can't afford to bring you here, and so we're going to deny you.
That's actually an interesting, I didn't really realize that they thought that way. That's interesting, because I would have thought that colleges would think, if we're not going to look at your financial situation at all, we're being more fair. But I kind of like that philosophy.
No, they actually think it's more fair. Right? And trust me, there's always something in it for the institution. And the reason why the institutions also want to do that's the ethical high ground that I just described. The other reason they want to do it is because students who are gapped are more likely not to finish. So they're more likely to drop out and not graduate, which hurts the colleges in the end, because their retention and graduation rates are lower as a result. So trust me, there is something in it for the college. They don't want to bring those students in and see them fail because that looks bad on the college. So that is what a need aware is. And at any point during the admissions process, and I describe in the book how Lafayette does it, they will toss these students out of the pool because they can't afford them and they will end up denying them. So need aware, need blind, meets full need, gapping. I think we covered those 4 aspects.
So maybe just highlight, so need blind, how many schools are really doing that? I mean, you don't have to be the exact number, but you know.
It is, so need blind meets full need. I think that is more, I just actually had these numbers a couple months ago. It's like 20 or 30.
Yeah,
and I can post up. It's not many. It's not many. There are a lot more need blind schools that do not meet full need. So if a school says we're need blind, really look into, does that mean they meet full need? Because schools advertise their need blind, and to parents and students, that sounds, oh, that's great.
Right.
But in many cases, it might not be good. So you really have to investigate this.
So that means, 20 schools maybe fall into that category. So the majority of schools are in some way kind of looking at a
financial aid somewhere. Yeah.
Somewhere in the process. Yeah.
So
you guys, families should not be surprised at that. That they're kind of mixing an academic decision with a financial decision.
Right. And then I think the one final thing, Debbie, to kind of jump into is the difference between kind of merit aid and discounts and financial aid when it comes to need-based aid. For a long time, and I get into the history of this in the book, first of all, most colleges back in the 50s and 60s, they were so inexpensive and not many people went to college, didn't even offer financial aid. Right. It wasn't really even a thing. Then financial aid became a thing in the 1960s. The Higher Education Act kind of put in place federal loans and the Pell Grants and so forth. And so financial aid then became a thing. If you went to school in the 80s, which is very possible for many parents here, most financial aid was based on need. You filled out these forms. Your family was seen as not being able to afford college in some way, and they gave you money. And everybody else kind of paid full price. Paying full price for college back in the 80s was not that uncommon.
It was also kind of doable. Mostly.
Because it was doable, right? It was doable because of the prices. So it was not that uncommon. But then basically in the late 1980s, we started to see a demographic cliff in the country. Those Gen Xers, I graduated high school in 1991, and we had kind of this big drop off right around then. So colleges had built all these dorms, had built all these classrooms, and they turned around and they said, what are we going to do to get people in the door? And that's when enrollment management was, and I get into the book was kind of discovered or invented in the 1970s. It really took off in the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s. And this enrollment management was essentially what the airlines do or hotels do, is they give people little discounts here and there to pull them in. So they know, instead of, they know, Debbie, if I give you another $500 or another $1,000, you're going to come to my school and you're going to pay the difference. And so rather than give a $100,000 scholarship to one kid, they will split that among 4 different kids and they'll get some revenue from it because you're going to have to pay the difference. And so it's all about this idea of revenue management. Again, just exactly what the airlines do. They know what kind of discounts they need to offer. Well, I guess before the pandemic,
right.
I'm not quite sure they have to offer everybody a discount now, but they know exactly how much money they have to offer, but they don't call these discounts. Well, they do call them discounts, but for the most part, what they're telling families,
to parents, right?
But not directly to parents, they call these things merit scholarships because it sounds great, right? My kid got a merit scholarship. And they usually do base it on SAT and SAT, ACT. We'll maybe talk about that later in GPA, right? Because they're also trying to get really good students to come in who might go elsewhere, right? So This is all about the ranking. So goes back to the buyers and sellers. A lower ranked school who wants to try to rise in the rankings will try to grab kids from a little bit above them who would go to probably a slightly academically better school, and they'll say, you come here and we'll give you more money. And it's all around this idea of enrollment management. So that's the difference. That's the key difference between merit aid and need-based aid. And the merit aid side, they'll give you more money in some cases than your EFC, right? So it's not really based on, some of it's based on need, but most of it's based on this idea of merit or discounts.
And in the book, you also talk about there are companies that are kind of they do a lot of modeling, behind this. So this isn't like willy nilly. This isn't like, we like Joe, we're going to give him a little bit more money. This actually like, they're doing statistics and probability about if I'm going to give out this money, what's the likelihood that student and family are actually going to
and trust
enroll.
me, this has become a huge business. And I talk about this in the book, and I interview Brian Zucker, who runs a small little firm out of Chicago or out of Evanston, who has about 60 schools. It's all these quants. If any of you are fans of baseball and Moneyball, it is Moneyball for colleges is exactly what it is. How do we fill a class and get the most, what they call net tuition revenue? How do we get the most money from parents, fill the class with the smartest kids that we can get? So it's all this balancing all these different priorities. Or how do we get more kids from California? So it may be different priorities. Most of the time it's around academics, but it may be around other needs the college has. They want to diversify their student body in some way, or they need more English majors. This is a big, by the way, this is a big thing that I think is important to point out. Sometimes the discounts are based on what you want to major in. So if a school has a really popular major, they're not going to discount as much for that because they know they're going to get enough students to fill the seats in that major. But if they don't have English or history, that probably the best examples, right? They have to have an English department, and they have to have so many English majors, and people just don't want to come to this college to major in English. You're probably going to get a bigger discount at those places because of that.
And not to spend too much more time, because we actually have a lot of more topics, but any advice or hints for people about how they can find out why colleges are giving out this merit scholarship? So you said like some schools make it pretty clear. They have a chart on their website. They'll say, if you have this SAT, ACT score and this GPA, we're going to give you this amount. And others, you don't know anything about it.
And they're not going to tell you.
Yeah.
They're not going to tell you because it's really caught up in, first of all, they don't want you to try to game the system because if you know too much, you kind of mess up their algorithms a little bit, and they don't want you to know that. But one way to tell, and this is really kind of at the basis of buyers and sellers. And so I give out some of this information. If you buy the book, you'll get a bigger data set of schools, but I'll tell you kind of the formula we use. We look at acceptance rate. The lower the acceptance rate for a college and the higher the yield meaning how many students get accepted who end up enrolling. That means your school is really popular if you have a low acceptance rate and a high yield. The third piece that goes into the formula buyers and sellers is a key one is the percentage of aid that is merit-based or non-need-based aid. Percentage of aid. The higher the percentage of aid that's non-need-based, the more likely that school is a buyer because they have to put that money out on the street to get those students.
Got it. So I just want to tell everybody, I feel we are in some ways throwing a lot of information out to everybody. It's all good information. And I'm just going to plant the seed that we will actually come back in a few weeks with some other series, and we'll go into detail about, where you find some of this information and that type of stuff. But it's really important to just get the general lay of the land, about, how the process works. And I always encourage people, honestly, one of the reasons I got into this space is I want people to feel empowered to understand this. This is just understanding the process, just as if you were going to go buy a car and you needed to understand, how they price it and all the features that go into it. You need to understand the process of how colleges operate and how it's going to impact you. And going back to your book, Jeff, that it's a perfect read to understand that whole process. Okay, so moving on. I feel like we talked a lot about the financial side, but just kind of important is insights into kind of the academic review of a student's application. I'm going to also read one more quote or a section from your book. I always knew this term holistic. I think people have probably heard it as well. It's been thrown around, but I'm not quite sure maybe there isn't really a definition for it, but we'll talk about it. But this is what you wrote in the book. You said, holistic admissions raises questions about fairness when admissions officers review tons of thousands of applications under the pressures of rigid deadlines. The more selective the institution, the murkier its process often is. Although it has the veneer of numerical precision, holistic admissions is pretty subjective. While colleges like the flexibility of the process, the process gives for a rough sorting of applicants to a skeptical public, holistic admissions is confusing and secretive at best and nefarious and illegal at worst. So that's a lot in there. Maybe you can tell us.
Holistic admissions, which is on the surface, we probably support it, right? Holistic admissions it goes beyond a test score and a grade to allow somebody in, right? And for the most part, we think those two things, the test score and probably the grade, should lead. But of course, we want a quote unquote well-rounded student. And that is what holistic admissions allows institutions to do. But in reality, holistic admissions essentially allows institutions to admit whoever they really want to admit. And I think that's the point about this. I put in a free link to a Wall Street Journal piece that was an excerpt from the book from 2 weeks ago that appeared on Apple News. So it's a free link for those who are not subscribers to the Wall Street Journal, but it goes inside the process from one of the chapters. And every school has a formula. And when they look at the application, they rate students on academics, on extracurriculars. They usually have a catch-all category. Harvard calls it personal, and intellectual curiosity, which is what Emory called it. So they have these catch-all categories, and they rate candidates 1 to 5, 1 to 10, 10 to 1. It could be just the opposite. I was at one school where it was the opposite, and I was really confused because I'm like, all these kids are getting 2s. That must be terrible.
Right.
It really was the opposite, right? So, and when you look at these formulas, you think, wow, how precise. What's the difference between a 3 and a 5? And it looks precise. And so to the public, it's like they're really looking at these things and they're being precise about it. But when you really dig down into it, it is 1 or 2 or a couple people's opinions looking at an application in 5 or 10 minutes. And that's really what they're doing. And it's what you tell them. And this is a really key point in the book, Debbie, as you know. If whatever you tell them or whatever you don't tell them, that's what they're looking at. And this goes back to the Varsity Blues scandal, right? People are always saying, well, how did they not know? Meaning the admissions officers. They're not detectives.
Right.
So, and that's on a good and bad front, right? So if you don't tell them something, they're not going to find it out. But if you also tell them something, you're not really clear about it, or you don't tell them what your true passions are, they're never going to get that. And this happened a couple of times where a teacher or a counselor in their recommendation would talk about an activity the student had. And most of the time, I understand these are brag sheets that, the counselor may not even know the student that well, but the student puts down on the brag sheet, participated in this activity for 4 years. Counselor must think, wow, that person really likes that. And then the admissions officer will be looking through the application and will see no other evidence that the student was really that interested in that activity. They didn't write about it in their essays and things like that. So one of the things I point out in the book is when you're done with the application, single application, don't look at all your applications at once. Single application to this particular school. What does it tell you about you as a student? And is this the story, when somebody looks at you for 5 or 10 minutes, is this the story that you want to tell to that person on the other side of the desk? That to me is really the test that you should be putting your application through.
No, that's a great way of saying it. Somebody also once said to me, if like your application was thrown on the floor and somebody picked it up randomly and read it, could they know it was yours and not somebody else's?
Yeah, and that's a big point, Debbie, because especially at these selective schools, think about this. I mean, this was one of the surprising findings of the book, is the depth and breadth of most of these application pools. The year I was there, Emory had 30,000 applications for 7,000 spots. Or I'm sorry, for a couple thousand spots. They ended up accepting a couple more thousand, obviously, because not everybody who's accepted comes. 30,000, 8,000 high schools. Students from 8,000 high schools applied. So you may think, if you're a parent on here tonight, you may think my son or daughter is really great, right? They're in the top 10 of their class. They've done all these things. Now just take your child and replicate him or her a dozen times, 24 times. And that's what ends up happening. And so after a while, all these applications in some ways look the same. They write about the same thing. They participate in the same activities. They've all gotten 1490, 13, whatever it is on the SAT. And you're really trying to stand out from that group.
So here, Bob Berg is asking, can you speak to students who aren't willing or wanting to toot their own horn?
So I don't think it's about tooting your own horn. It's just about telling your story. And I think there's a difference. If you're really interested in something, tell an admissions officer about it. It doesn't. I saw somebody in the comment, somebody at 18 may not have a passion, and that's very true. You may not have a passion. You may not even know what you want to do at this point in your life, and that's fine, totally fine. In fact, they like people like that. It's interesting at Emory, and I talk about this in the book, as they're reviewing an application, everybody will put down their major and things like that. But one of the admissions officers I followed at Emory would always ask, and they read in pairs, so there would always be somebody else reading with them on the other side. They would say, what will Debbie do here? Like, what could you imagine Debbie doing here? Not what does Debbie want to major in, not what Debbie says she wants to do here. What could you imagine her doing here? And that's how they start to think about these students based on what they've said, based on what their recommendations say. Because I think most students want to put this curated version of themselves out there. They're looking for those students who are just true to themselves and true in their applications. So
here's an interesting comment, and I know you actually touch on this a little later in the book. But
I saw that comment.
Why not do a lottery?
This has been proposed a million times.
Yeah.
And one way you could do it is have a floor. So you have to get over that floor, and then everybody else is put into a hat. Here's why. Colleges talk about building a community. I think they're kidding themselves about building this very specific community, but they are building a community. They want to make sure they have enough business majors, enough English majors. They want to make sure they have enough kids from California or wherever. They want to make sure they have enough kids, and this is very true, to fill a baseball team or a football team or the band or the orchestra or whatever. If you had put them all into a lottery, you would have to have so many controls on that lottery to make sure you can fill all those roster spots and all those activities and have the diversity you want. So that's the hardest thing I think about a lottery. In essence, what it is a lottery already. There is sometimes no logic for why somebody gets in and why somebody doesn't get in. And this goes back to the whole control thing. There's only so much control you have over this process.
Here's another comment here. It's a little long, but maybe I'll just read it because I don't want to block up the screen. But they're saying, do universities actually reject students who they think have a better credentials than at their school? Kind of like, like if there was a student that applied that looks like, well, this student has such great grades. Why are they and whatever, and why are they applying to us? Do you think they would actually reject them because they look too good for their school?
Yeah, well, they will reject them if they really care about yield, because they're going to think they're going to go somewhere else. In fact, I quote a study in the paper. This goes back to a couple of questions we've gotten on demonstrated interest tonight. If they think you're applying to them as the safety school, and I know I said earlier, don't use that term, but if they think you're the safety school, they're more likely to reject you because they think, well, you're never going to pick us anyway. And we don't want to, our goal here is to keep up the yield. And so I talk about a study on this, that unless if you really want to go to that school, you better show demonstrated interest. You better show up to when you could, tours, call them, show that you're interested. But if you're just applying to them as a backup, they're going to recognize that and they will reject you as a result.
So we didn't talk a lot about, maybe, you can touch on, now that a lot of schools are test optional. I guess maybe the topic is, how much did the test scores really factor into any of the things that you saw, when most schools were actually accepting them? And now that they're test optional, do you think they're really going to make a difference in the admissions process?
I make this point very early in the book. Parents and students are in love with tests. Colleges, not so much. And that was true before the pandemic, and it's even more true now. The SAT, so two biggest predictors of success in college are high school curriculum and grades. Did you take the toughest courses that you could take, especially if you're in the sciences, for example, and did you get good grades in them? And did you do that over the course of a couple of years? So usually they'll throw out freshman year grades in high school, but sophomore, junior, and senior, did you take a succession of the right courses, and did you score? And again, we're talking about selective admissions here. Did you do well in them? SAT, ACT scores, in terms of predictor of success in college, number 3 on the list, and sometimes a very distant 3. So how would they use test scores? It was usually first of all, most students are looking at that middle 50% range when they're applying. And so many students who don't have that middle 50% range, they don't even apply. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Most of the applications look so similar because it's all the same people applying, right? If you have a low score and you think, well, I have no chance of getting in there, I'm not even going to apply. And so what ends up happening is you have this compression of scores in the middle. But how would they use them if they're unfamiliar with a high school and they're not quite sure what does this grade mean or what does this curriculum mean? They'll say, well, how did this student do on the SAT or the ACT? If this person had really high grades and a really low test score, they'll look a little deeper there. Or just the opposite. They had a really high test score and low grades. They're going to, did this person really work to their potential? So most of the time, it's the outliers where the score would make a difference, or not make a difference, be really taken into consideration. Or it would be those cases where they're unfamiliar with the high school and they want to have a check-in. I call it a check-in, really. And it's not, in most cases, in the 3 schools that I was at, it was not a driving force in decisions. Now, I don't know if you want to talk about test optional.
Yeah, but before we do that, so I'm really curious because I had always assumed, honestly, at the big state schools, like, and you were at University of Washington, they don't use test scores at least to kind of like separate out. They get so many applications that they just can't go through. They don't maybe say, these kids who didn't even make this.
No, some publics do that. University of Washington doesn't do that. In fact, the College Board tells schools not to use cutoffs for admissions, but you're right. Many schools receive way too many applications. They don't have a chance to read them. There was a question in there about 1, 2, 3. One, in terms of the top 3 considerations for admissions. One is high school grades. Number 2 is high school courses. Number 3 is SAT. So courses and grades are 2 separate things. 1 and 2, even though they're obviously related.
And when you say courses, they are like kind of looking at what kind of did you push yourself? Did the student push themselves? What level?
Yeah, and this is a question I get all the time. How do they compare kids from different high schools? They're really looking within the context of the high school. So they get something called the high school profile with your application that's sent by the high school. And it basically says, here are all the courses that are available and the percentage of students who go to college. It's like facts and figures about your high school. So they know, for example, that you offer 15 AP courses or whatever it is. They know kind of the courses you offer. And what they're going to look at is, did you take, the most difficult courses you could take within your high school? Again, selective admissions. Less selective colleges. I saw a question on there. We are talking about the top, 20%, 30% of colleges here. And I want to be very frank about that. I didn't go to a highly selective college at all. And I had a great experience. I've had a great life. I talk about this in the book. It's not just about the name that you put on the back of your car. Sometimes I think going to quote unquote a brand name college is much more about the parents than it is about the students. Go to a place that's going to be a good fit. And in reality, there's not that much of a difference between school number 25 and 50. In most cases, students are looking at a band of schools. If you use the rankings, between 25 and 60 or 60 and 100, there's not that much of a difference. Yes. Is there a difference between 1 and 200? Of course. But nobody's really deciding between Harvard and number 200 on the
right
rankings.
So what about test optional this year? How do you think that it is affecting this season? How do you think it will affect really the future of how the admissions process will go?
Well, one thing about the test, if you can't take it, don't try to take it. If colleges say they're test optional, they really are test optional. You really have to believe them. Now, some people keep asking, well, for financial aid, will they take it into consideration? They're not supposed to. And many colleges are kind of revamping their financial aid processes not to accept it. The fact of the matter is, they're not going to have a lot of test scores. You're not going to be at a disadvantage. I was talking to the dean of the University of Chicago the other day, and they've been test optional for a couple of years. But in a normal year, 85% of their students are still submitting scores because they're applying to other places that require the test. They don't think they're going to get 50% of students to submit scores this year. So this is actually the year. If you're not a good tester, don't try to take it. And don't worry about it. And then what you're saying, then you're going to say, well, I am a good tester. I'm going to score really well on it. And will it help me? High school curriculum and grades are going to help you a lot more. And you're going to say, well, then my grades are not so good and my test score would be good. Well, in some ways that might hurt you because they're going to, again, think you're not living up to your potential if that test score is so much better than your grades. So take it if you can, but don't worry about it if you can't.
And what do you think is going to happen? Just, let's hope next year we're out of the pandemic. You think schools are going to go back to
I don't think most schools will. I think the top, the very elite schools in this country will, but I think most schools won't. In fact, the dean of admissions at Davidson College told me they have a 3-year pilot, but we're not going back. He said we're definitely not going back to testing. And I think you're going to see a lot of schools say we got the class we wanted. It's a great class. We're not going back.
It's kind of amazing. I would have never in my wildest dreams thought that this is the way that, like
testing would end.
Testing would end and the test prep industry would kind of, fall apart a little bit, and the College Board and the ACT, you could never have predicted this.
Debbie, it's interesting. I just finished a piece that's going to appear in the Atlantic about whether this will kill off testing. What's interesting to me is that over 1,000 schools were already test optional before the pandemic, yet, and that list was growing every year. Yet the number of people taking the SAT and the ACT have actually been going up. People still take tests, even when it's test optional, because they think it's going to help them.
I think you're right. I think they think it's going to help them. I think it's also human nature, and I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but that you want to hold on to something that's more concrete, in
that's
this
the thing.
process.
Going back to holistic admissions, right? Yeah. It is the quantifiable thing. Right. It's a single score. That's not a grade that maybe has been massaged in any way. We all know about grade inflation. So we think this is our one score. Yeah.
So Anne says, can we get rid of the APs next?
Some schools are doing that.
Yeah.
And I see somebody said, if you take the test and don't do well, just don't submit it. Don't submit it.
Yeah. And I have seen oodles of people talk about how they're waiting on the phone call to talk to somebody at the ACT or the College Board, like hours. I would just put it aside and just,
Yeah, and some people keep asking, if I scored well, should I submit it? Sure, submit it. They're going to look at it. And what is a good SAT score? Look at that middle 50% range from the past years. If you're in it or above it, submit it. If you're below it or at the low end of it, don't submit it. I think that's the best way to describe this.
So here's a good question. Again, kind of considering financially what's happening with the schools, do you think there'll be less merit scholarship money available, because the schools are not pulling in the same revenue they are this year?
I actually think there may be more because they're going to be desperate to fill seats. So at those, especially if you look at my list, the extreme buyers or the mid-tier buyers, they are going to be really desperate to fill seats. And I think they're going to spend more money next year to do that. Some colleges, and we're going to be doing a series, Debbie, coming up. Some colleges may spend the bank to keep going for a couple of years and then go out of business. And we'll talk about that in a future series that we're going to be doing together. But I actually think they're going to be spending more.
So I had a question, and I actually didn't see this in your book. I don't think I did. But was there any discussion, or did you hear anything at the 3 schools of, people in the admissions themselves kind of worried about the price of college? We're talking about, how the system works, but did anybody kind of step back and say, I know I'm working at a school and I know it's crazy what's going on with these prices. And I understand why families are, up in arms or can't afford this. I'm just wondering if that discussion ever happened on that side of the.
Sure. But they think it's worth it. They truly believe in their mission and what they're doing and their institution. Otherwise, I don't think they would be doing these jobs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so wow, it's almost the end of the hour.
That was a great hour.
So before we go, you want to just give maybe a little advice on if you could say something to the parents of a high school, senior or somebody, who's starting high school. Is there any advice for what how they should approach this process, and how you think it, might change for the people who are maybe, younger in high school right now?
So a couple of things. Let me go back to this whole idea of selectivity. And I picked selective schools because the admissions process is interesting at those places and they are in the conversation. But as I said earlier, I did not go to a selective school. I went to a great place, Ithaca College, upstate New York. I'm on the board of trustees there. My college roommate is anchor of ABC World News, David Muir. Bob Iger just stepped down from CEO of Disney, went to Ithaca. Like, I went with great people. I sit on the board of trustees with great people. And many of my friends and friends who went to also not selective schools have done great things in their life, right? So it goes back to fit. That place was just a great fit for me at that point in my life. My parents can afford it. It was good all around. And I think that's what's important where you're going. You want to be swimming. The way I describe it in the book is that you want to be swimming with people like you in this stream, right? So if you go to a school and you're at the front of the line because you're so academically better than everybody else there, they're going to pull you back. But if you also go to a school that maybe is just too much of a reach for you academically, you're going to be kind of swimming against that tide. That goes back to the academic fit of the school. Worry less about the names. Go to a place that fits you academically, socially, and financially. That's number one. Number two, there's a lot you can't control right now. I get it. You really want to take the SAT and you can't. You really want to be in school and you're probably online. You want to get that recommendation from a teacher who has no time. There's all these things you can't control. There are things you can control. You can take the courses you're taking, try to get the grades you're want to get. You have a chance to write your essay now because you're at home and maybe you have some more free time. Yes, I understand your fall sports and other things have been canceled. I get it. It really sucks. It really does. There's no other way to put it. But the great thing about this is that it's everybody's in this boat right now. This is a pandemic affecting the whole world, and at least affecting every state in this country. So it's not like you're at a disadvantage because of it. So go back to what I said earlier, kind of control what you can control. And I know that sounds like a cliche, and it's great advice for somebody like myself who's not applying to college this year, or doesn't have kids applying to college, but really control what you can control. And I think that if you have built a list that is of 8 to 10 or 12 places that you really want to go, there are a mix of these buyers and sellers. They're good academic and social fits. You're going to get into, probably half or more of them. You're going to get good aid from some of them if you have buyers on it. And you're going to have some good choices at the end. And through the process, you're probably going to learn about yourself because in some cases, your list might change during that. And that's okay. It's all okay to use this as a learning process about who you are, what you want to do. And the one final thing, I guess, and I think all the parents know this out there, college is a staging ground for the rest of life, but it's not the only staging ground, right? You're going to have many moments throughout your life where you're at a quote unquote proverbial fork in the road. And you're going to have to make a lot of decisions, right? When you have kids, when you get married, when you change jobs, whatever it might be, right? So you're going to have many of these things. And I realize this is the biggest thing probably in your 18-year-old or 17-year-old or 16-year-old's life right now, but it's one of many decisions they're going to make. And it's not the only one, and it's certainly not the last one. So don't make it that it's the biggest, it's a big deal, but it's not the biggest deal in their life for the rest of their life.
Well, great advice. Thank you, Jeff. I know I can see all the thank yous that people are putting in the comments, that everybody got a really good feel for the process. And we'll put the link one more time. Jeff's book comes out the 15th. Tuesday.
This coming Tuesday, right here.
You can pre-order it, and
now.
I won't go into it. There's a whole thing about the publishing world. If you can pre-order it, it really helps.
It really helps. Yes. And you'll get this very cool, because I can't come to your house right now and sign it. You'll get this really cool book plate, which you can stick in your book, and I'll sign it. This one's not signed, but I'll sign yours. You'll get it in the mail, and you can stick it in the book. I also have a couple of other goodies that you'll get if you pre-order the book.
Yeah, so pre-order, and truly, it's a very enjoyable read. It's far from dry. It's actually very entertaining and informative. So that's like the best combination that there is.
Thank you so much, Debbie.
Okay, everybody, we will see you soon. We'll have more information on some upcoming interesting webinars and Facebook Lives. So thank you, everybody. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
Bye.